if you've been watching reviews of the Hyundai Inster / Casper, the media has overwhelmingly missed the point about this car in not one, but duos important ways, dude. And the first one is that this is the first example we've seen, from Hyundai at least, of the kind of car that EVs were meant to be. And when I say meant to be, obviously you can build big lardy-assed EVs that weigh 2.6 tons and need 130 kilowatt hour batteries, but I would argue, and I'm looking at you, Kia EV9 et al., if you're building EVs like that, to the extent that EVs can be some kind of literal vehicle for planetary salvation or something, those kinds of EVs are not it. These kinds of EVs are, because they're not a tremendous drain on the Earth's resources, and they're not involved in this kind of engineering catch-up game of diminishing returns, where the vehicle is so freaking heavy that it needs a preposterously large battery to carry it around, which adds more weight, which needs a preposterously larger battery to carry it round. And if you carry these design iterations through to their ultimate conclusion, of course, you get the Tesla Semi, which is still not deployed, and for very good reasons, I would argue, okay? So let's think about the Insta in comparison. This thing has got like a 40-something kilowatt hour battery, depending on which spec you buy. The entry level's like 42, and the two higher levels are 49 kilowatt hours, which is roughly half of the battery in many EVs. And it's also a physically small vehicle. And to put that in perspective, because most people know what a Toyota Corolla is, this vehicle is about 800 millimeters shorter than a Toyota Corolla, which is about 2 feet 8 inches or something in the old money. So it's about that much shorter. But the wheelbase is only this much shorter, so it's like 120 less wheelbase. And that means that relative to its overall size, the wheelbase is really quite high. And that makes this vehicle quite chuckable. You know, the low center of mass, the chuckability, and all of that stuff, really impressive for a vehicle that essentially also weighs about the same as a Toyota Corolla. So this is not some behemoth that you can plug in and convince yourself that, using some nebulous logic, that you are actually saving the planet or doing the right thing, however you frame it in your own head. This is actually a vehicle that is not that intensively devoted to consuming the Earth's limited natural resources, and it's also very city friendly because it's only about 1.6 meters wide. So it's kind of funny sitting in this car because you've got heaps of headroom. You could be like a team of basketball players, or 4 people on a basketball team, sitting in this car, and you would have heaps of room except shoulder room. You know, when I get in here with my missus or my daughter, we're rubbing shoulders and elbowing each other in the guts, trying to get the belts on contemporaneously and all that stuff. It's actually quite narrow this way, but seemingly spacious at the same time because there's so much headroom, and because the wheelbase is so long relative to the overall length of the vehicle, the cabin space is pumped up as well, and you don't get that claustrophobic experience. The next thing about this car is that it's so fun to drive at about, let's call it 7 out of 10. Right, so we're in Galston Gorge at the moment, which is on the northern end of Sydney, and it's quite a nice drive. Like, if they closed the road, it'd be quite a nice drive. But just to flow through here, particularly using the regen for the braking, it's a very satisfying driving experience from that perspective, much more satisfying than driving a Toyota Corolla. And I've always really liked chuckable tiny cars. Like, I used to own a Renault Sport Clio, which was so much fun to get up on 3 wheels, you know. And this car is reminiscent of that, and it's also reminiscent of a lot of cheaper tiny cars except that it doesn't have a hateful CVT rubber band kind of experience in the powertrain, and it's not rattly and shaky and giving you all the evidence that you ever need that a few more welds could have been used, a few more spot welds in the assembly process would not have gone astray. This thing feels just rock solid. The corner's really flat. It's fun to drive, to the extent that an EV can be fun to drive because of its chuckability. It's fun to drive. Now, I don't want to gush because this car is not perfect, and there's a couple of things that I really don't understand about it. Like, I don't understand why they didn't just call it the Ioniq 2, because most of Hyundai's electric vehicles, and particularly electric-only vehicles, have an Ioniq number naming system, right? And that seems to work. Like, it works pretty well for me. I understand it. And this would fit in pretty well as the Ioniq 2, and people would understand where it fits in. This gives them the scope to release like a K-car version, the Ioniq 1, and also to slot in a 3 and a 4 below the Ioniq 5 and 6 and the upcoming Ioniq 9, right? But no, for some reason known only to them, in a whole bunch of meetings that involve clipboards and PowerPoint, I'm freaking sure, probably a spreadsheet, they decided to call this the Casper / Inster. Inster in Australia, Casper in other markets, right? I don't get that. When you invest so much money in a sub-brand called Ioniq, why not pump it up with as many vehicles as you can? Anyway, that's the matter for them. The vehicle exists. The other thing is the rear, like the seating capacity and the spaciousness, except for the shoulder room, fantastic, all right? But the rear luggage space, to me at least, is just poorly thought out, at best. It's poorly thought out because it's got this kind of bin arrangement, but the bin arrangement under the floor doesn't really work that well. And how long have we had electric cars now? It must be at least 10 years. Car manufacturers have still not figured out a way of incorporating the charging brick in its own location, like in its proper location. It just floats around in the floor. And then if you've got something big to carry, you got to slide the seats forward, and the existing bin configuration doesn't work really well with that. They could have done a lot better than that, in my view. Obviously, like most electric cars, you've got tyre pressure monitoring system and a tin of goop, but you don't actually have a spare tyre. So out in the boonies here, where if I roll down the window, we can have the banjo music competing with the annoying, super annoying ADAS. If I get a flat tyre here, I'm making a call, right? I'm not going anywhere, and the car, where it goes next, is going to be on the back of a freaking flatbed, which I think is a suboptimal solution as well. Another way in which reviewers have typically missed the whole point of this car is that if you've got the money to spend on an EV, you are pretty affluent in our society. If you're a battler, you're not buying a new car. And even if you can stretch up to a new car, you're not buying an EV because they are at such a premium price compared with equivalent combustion cars. That's just a fact. So if you're in the market for an EV and you live in the inner city and you want to do quote unquote the right thing and do your bit to save the planet, whatever, then you expect a bit of premium. And in the tiny little small car space, sorry about this bunch of ducks on the road, banjo music, you expect a premium product, right? You just do. And this car is clearly a premium product. Now, what all reviewers, or most reviewers, have said about this vehicle is that it's quote unquote too expensive. And this proposition arises as a consequence of not factoring in quality or value or premiumness, whatever you want to call it. They're not factoring that in. And that's kind of important, and we don't do this in other aspects of life. Like, you can go to Big W or Kmart or something and buy a pair of unbranded sports shoes, trainers, whatever. They're not going to be the same as a pair of Nikes or Asics or New Balance, whatever. So we pay more for those brands because of the premium features that are associated with them intrinsically, even though most people buying them are not elite athletes and probably would perform almost the same in comparatively shitty unbranded shoes, right? We do the same thing with power tools. You've got DeWalt and Makita and Milwaukee and all of those brands like that competing, I guess, with Ryobi and Ozito and other brands of that nature. And nobody minds paying more for the premium power tool brands. The same thing goes for kitchen appliances and virtually everything else that sane people buy in the consumer domain all the time. And I would argue that this vehicle is only too expensive if you take quality and premium and all of that out of the equation. The other thing I'd suggest is that a lot of the vehicles that are notionally cheaper that make this vehicle seem expensive are vehicles associated with brand names that we don't know or understand yet because they simply haven't been deployed in the market for long enough. So if you mix all consumer products up and just rank them on price alone, then yeah, the Insta is way too expensive. But if you factor in the known brand, the premium features, the driving experience, and the fact that it is kind of compact and city friendly, then Insta is an insanely good proposition for a small number of people who fit into this category of people who want to do the right thing, live in the inner city, and understand that less, meaning less material, less battery, etc., is actually more in the domain of environmental virtue. As for the driving experience, even out here, which is so fish out of water for this car because clearly we're in the boonies, the ergonomics are pretty spot on for driving. Everything's well laid out from a control point of view. There's heaps of buttons, and the features that you use most often are devoted to buttons, which is very important if you subscribe to Adam Savage's hypothesis of first order retrievability as that pertains to the architecture of a control system in a car. You need the things that you really need in a car all the time accessible by button, because it might seem like futuristic to have everything on a big screen behind a menu system, but in terms of the cognitive workload when you're actually driving and also need to adjust something, it's an epic ergonomics fail to do that. Subsystems that need to be tweaked only occasionally, they can be inside a menu, but everything you need all the time, like the HVAC and the audio system controls and things of that nature, they are accessible by buttons. And one of my favourite things about Hyundai EV control architecture is the paddles here on the wheel to tweak up or down the regenerative braking. When you're doing that flow style of driving, 6, 7, maybe 7.5 out of 10, it's very easy in this car to crank up the regen and then just get your foot off the throttle to slow the car down enough to give yourself that really pleasant sort of turn-in experience into a bend and then just accelerate out. And I wish more manufacturers would make the tweaking of the regen as accessible as Hyundai does, because it really is a pleasant flow type driving experience. Now you can probably hear those beeps and bongs in the background, and that is ADAS. ADAS on modern cars sucks, and this car is absolutely no exception. The ADAS in this car, it's a golf ball through 100 metres of half-inch Nilex, right? It's a big suck, in other words. But it's hard to blame only Hyundai for this, because Hyundai is striving for the big 5-star safety rating. I just thought I'd pop in briefly from the future, as you do. A few days after that emotionally uplifting and spiritually fulfilling test drive in the Insta, I gave it back, and then shortly thereafter, ANCAP lobbed with the official safety rating on that vehicle, which was 4 stars. And I thought about that, why isn't it 5? And then the penny dropped, because Insta was first released as the Casper in South Korea in, I did write it down here, September of 2021. which means that the fundamental design work on the platform must have kicked off in 2017 or 2018, something like that. That, of course, was a combustion version with a 1 litre 3-cylinder engine. The base model was Atmo, and the models above that, if memory served, were blown, turbocharged, whatever. So the bottom line there is that several years later, the Casper Electric in South Korea and the Inster in Europe and other markets were deployed in about June of 2024. And although the vehicle seems quite new to us, it's actually quite an old car, because by the time it had been deployed here, which was April this year, it was coming up for 3.5, 4 years old kind of thing. And that means that the fundamental design work on the platform took place about 2 iterations of the ANCAP safety rating system ago, and therefore I'm not all that surprised that the rating is 4-star. And that was based on a couple of glitches that happened during the crash test, like the door came open in one of the tests, which was not supposed to happen, and I suppose that will be of interest to the dudes back in South Korea in the R&D centre in Namyang. They'll probably want to get to the bottom of that. And of course, the other thing that happened was that there was some minor separation of the driver's footwell during one of the tests as well, and that's really not supposed to happen. So designed for 4-star, but only just scraping through on 4-star for crash protection criteria as a result of these deductions that happen from those 2 defects. What's really interesting to me, though, is that the ANCAP safety rating, which is Australian, is based on the tests that were done by Euro NCAP, and the ratings protocol that flows from those tests is exactly the same for both agencies. However, when you look at how ANCAP categorises this 4-star result versus how Euro NCAP does, it seems to me that ANCAP is still operating with this mindset of 5-star is acceptable and everything else is a death trap, whereas Euro NCAP kind of says 5-star is excellent, but dude, 4-star is okay. I'll be drilling down into that in a kind of separate video, because this is not just an issue that pertains to the Insta here, it's an issue that pertains to how safe is safe enough, which is a really important issue to drill down into. And I would argue that the safety ratings themselves are not the full story about what kind of car is going to keep you and your loved ones and everyone else who shares the road with you as safe as possible. So that's coming up. Now back to that fat bastard driving the Insta in the boonies, just, a few Ks from this very fat cave. In order to do that, they need to comply with ANCAP and Euro NCAP safety requirements, right? They've got a whole safety standard for these things, and it's just super annoying and also unhelpful. There's no evidence that any of this bullshit saves anyone's lives, but it is preposterously annoying. And it trains you because it's so full of false positive warnings. It just trains you to ignore it. I'm getting beeped all the time for being 1 or 2 Ks an hour over the posted limit of 60 out here, right? Who cares? And also because I'm talking to you like this from time to time, the dreaded camera system here is noting the amount of time that my eyes are taking notionally off the road, even though I can see, 800 metres in front of me seemingly, and I'm not going that fast anyway, so there's nothing to hit. I get warnings about that, and I get warnings about things that I don't even understand. So that is hugely annoying, but really, duck alert once again, and an oncoming car, no ADAS warning for that. I get no warnings about that, and heaps of warnings about, things that just don't fucking matter. But it's really ANCAP's fault. ANCAP's problem, and Euro NCAP, is that for 20 years or 30 years or something, they've strived successfully to make the structural performance of cars in crashes and the auxiliary protection systems like airbags and things of that nature and pyrotechnic load limiting seatbelt pretensioners really effective. And now they're struggling for relevance, right? Ongoing relevance. And the only way they can remain relevant, I think, is to keep mandating ever more annoying ADAS-type safety systems with no proven track record of saving even one life. So that blows. One final thing I want to discuss while we're turning without burning, so to speak, or, remotely burning if you charged up with coal-fired electricity, is the batteries and how this all plays into the powertrain scenario, because most reviewers have accurately pointed out that there is a 71 kilowatt powertrain to go with the small battery in the entry-level model, and then there's an 85 kilowatt powertrain to go with the somewhat larger battery in the next two models up in the range. The small battery, of course, is, I'm going to say 42 kilowatts, and if I get any of these numbers wrong, because I'm doing it off the top of my head and driving on really, really bendy roads where it's kind of important not to come off and crash, I'll put up a correction on the screen. Okay, so a small battery is like 42 kilowatt hours, the big battery is 49, and I suspect that the actual electric motor and all the wiring across all three variants is exactly the same. It all makes perfect sense if you understand Ohm's law and the fact that power equals volts times amps. When you design a wiring system for essentially any machine, the wiring is designed to carry a particular number of amps maximum safely, right? This is the same for houses, it's the same for power tools, lathes, milling machines, welders, whatever. All the cabling is specified once the designer knows how many amps it has to carry. So the small battery here is, I'm going to say 266 volts, and the big battery is 310. And when you crunch all the numbers on this, it means that the low power output powertrain and the high power output powertrain are both carrying about 270 amps. Okay? And that tells me that the wiring in the motors is the same, and the disparity between the power outputs between the low output entry level model and the mid-spec one and the high-spec Insta Cross, that's all down to the battery, because the lower voltage means that for the same power output, the smaller battery would need to dump more amps into the wiring. And obviously the designers have imposed a limit on that, and it would be a mistake therefore to presume that the electric motor was just smaller or the wiring was smaller or something of that nature. I think this decision is purely predicated on the current carrying limitation of the high voltage wiring going into the motor from the battery via the inverter.